In 1976, the world was a different place. No DNA databases, no digital footprints, just a quiet stretch of highway and a person who vanished into the humid southern night. Back then, a disappearance wasn't tracked by pings on a cell tower or captured by the unblinking eye of a doorbell camera. When a life was interrupted in the Mississippi Delta in the mid-70s, it often left behind nothing but a vacuum of information. The humid air seemed to swallow the evidence whole, leaving families to wait by rotary phones that never rang and look out across front porches that remained empty for decades. For 49 years, the file on this case did more than just go cold. It gathered dust in a basement corner of the precinct. It became a relic of a different era, typewritten pages with fading ink, black and white Polaroids of a crime scene that the earth had long since reclaimed. 2 generations of lead detectives retired, taking their notes and their frustrations with them to the grave. To the rest of the world, the 1976 disappearance was a footnote, a ghost story whispered in the halls of the local courthouse. But the truth wasn't dead. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the world to catch up. Fast forward to the morning of May 14th, 2025. The contrast couldn't be more jarring. The humid silence of the Delta is replaced by the sharp, modern hum of a high-performance police cruiser as it pulls into a manicured driveway in a quiet, affluent suburb. The officers inside aren't carrying flashlights and paper maps. They're carrying digital warrants and genetic profiles. In a world now defined by high-resolution surveillance and global connectivity, the shadows of 1976 have nowhere left to hide. The 49-year-old secret that had survived through 10 presidencies and the turn of a century was about to be dismantled in a matter of minutes. This brings us to the promise of this investigation. This was not a case where the police were one lead away from an arrest. This was not a case where a witness finally decided to talk after decades of silence. In fact, for nearly half a century, every expert in the field, from local sheriffs to federal profilers, had labeled this case unsolvable. There were no fingerprints, there was no weapon, there was no obvious motive. The person who vanished in 1976 was a 16-year-old named Elizabeth or Beth Vaughn. She was a daughter, a sister, and a student who had her entire life mapped out ahead of her. Her disappearance didn't just break her family, it left a permanent scar on the psyche of her community. For 49 years, her name was synonymous with the limitations of human justice. But 2025 has rewritten the rules. We are about to walk through the account of how a single microscopic fragment, overlooked for decades, was finally decoded by a technology that didn't exist when Beth vanished. This is the story of an impossible breakthrough, a narrative that proves that while time can bury the evidence, it can never truly extinguish the truth. As we move through the next hour, remember this. The man the police were looking for on that morning in 2025 wasn't a monster hiding in the woods. He was a man who lived a full, respectable life. He was a man who believed that if you wait long enough, the past eventually becomes a ghost. He was wrong. To understand what happened to Elizabeth Vaughn, you first have to understand the world she lived in. Mississippi in 1976 was a place of deep roots and slow rhythms. It was a landscape of 2-lane blacktop roads lined with kudzu, of gas stations where the pumps still had rolling numbers, and of towns where your last name told people everything they needed to know about you. In the mid-70s, life was built on a foundation of local consistency. People didn't lock their front doors because they knew the person living 3 houses down the road. Children played in the front yards until the streetlights came on, and the sound of a passing car was an event, not a background noise. For a 16-year-old like Beth, this was a world of absolute safety, or at least the appearance of it. Beth lived a life marked by a steady, comforting routine. She was a junior in high school, a girl who spent her Friday nights at football games and her Sunday mornings in a wooden pew at the Baptist church. Her family was a fixture in the community. Her father worked at the local paper mill, and her mother was known for her needlework. It was a life of series of predictable milestones. She had a part-time job at the town's only pharmacy, where she helped stock the shelves and greet the regulars by name. She was a girl who took pride in her schoolwork and had already started collecting brochures for the state university. In the photographs from that year, she is the image of mid-70s youth, long, straight hair, bell-bottom jeans, and a smile that reached her eyes. She was a person with a history and a future, deeply embedded in a community that felt permanent and protective. This was the atmosphere of 1976, a time when the greatest concern for a teenager was a math test or a Friday night date. It was a world that felt solid, a world where the boundaries were clear and the dangers were distant. Then we reached the date of October 14th, 1976. It was a Thursday evening, and the Mississippi air was finally starting to lose its summer heat. The sun was setting earlier, casting a deep golden light over the cotton fields. Beth's day had been entirely ordinary. She had attended her classes, stayed late for a choir rehearsal, and returned home to have dinner with her parents and her younger brother. At 6:45 p.m., Beth told her mother she was going to walk to the local corner store just 4 blocks from her house. She needed to buy a poster board for a school project due the next day. Her mother didn't hesitate. The store was a straight shot down a well-lit residential street. Beth grabbed her lightweight jacket and a few dollar bills from the kitchen counter. She was expected back in 20 minutes. At 7:52 p.m., a neighbor saw Beth walking down the sidewalk. She was swinging her arms, looking at the houses as she passed. The neighbor waved, and Beth waved back. She appeared relaxed, her mind likely on the project she had to finish. At 7:02 p.m., the clerk at the corner store confirmed that Beth arrived. She bought a single sheet of white poster board and a pack of gum. They exchanged a few words about the upcoming homecoming game. The clerk noted that nothing seemed wrong. Beth wasn't being followed. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. She was just a teenager on a routine errand. Beth exited the store at 7:05 p.m., the rolled-up poster board tucked under her arm. The walk back should have taken exactly 7 minutes. The route was familiar, passing by the homes of people she had known since she was a toddler. It was a walk she had done hundreds of times in the dark. At 7:08 p.m., a car driving toward the town center passed Beth. The driver recognized her and noted she was about 2 blocks from her house. She was walking under a street lamp at the corner of Oak and Maple. This is a critical point in the timeline. The driver would later testify that Beth looked completely normal, walking at a steady pace, the white poster board clearly visible under her arm. This was the exact moment of silence. At 7:12 p.m., Beth's mother looked at the clock. At 7:20 p.m., she stepped out onto the front porch and scanned the street. The road was empty. The golden light of the afternoon had vanished, replaced by the deep indigo shadows of the evening. She walked to the edge of the driveway, calling Beth's name into the quiet air. There was no response. Somewhere in the 300-yard stretch between that street lamp on Oak and Maple and her own front door, the routine of Beth Vaughn's life was shattered. In the span of less than 4 minutes, a girl who was 4 blocks from safety simply ceased to exist in the physical world. The poster board she had purchased was never found. Her jacket was never found. No one heard a scream. No one heard a car door slam. No one saw a struggle. One moment she was walking under the light of a street lamp, and the next there was only the sound of the cicadas and the cooling asphalt of a Mississippi night. The world of 1976 had provided Beth with every reason to feel safe, but on that October evening, it failed her in a way that would take nearly half a century to explain. When the sun rose on the morning of October 15, 1976, the town was already transformed. What had started as a mother's frantic walk to the corner store had become a full-scale mobilization of the county's resources. But in 1976, those resources were painfully limited. This was an era of policing that relied almost entirely on what could be seen with the human eye or heard with the human ear. There were no digital footprints to follow. There were no cell towers to provide a location, no GPS data to track a vehicle's movement, and no unblinking lenses of security cameras mounted on the eaves of houses. Investigators were forced to work in a vacuum of information. The search for Elizabeth Vaughn was one of the largest the state had ever seen. For 7 days, the local schools were closed so that the community could focus entirely on the woods and the riverbanks. Hundreds of men and women walked in long, disciplined lines through the thick Mississippi brush, using sticks to move the heavy layers of fallen leaves. They searched every culvert, every abandoned barn, and every square inch of the muddy riverbank. But the earth in the delta is thick and forgiving. It hides things well. Despite the thousands of man-hours spent combing the landscape, the search parties found absolutely nothing. No scrap of fabric from Beth's jacket, no fragment of the poster board she had been carrying, not even a scuff mark in the dirt to indicate where she had been taken. It was as if she had been lifted off the pavement by the wind itself. As the weeks turned into months, the initial energy of the search began to settle into a heavy, permanent grief. The local police, frustrated by the lack of physical evidence, began to focus on the people Beth knew. They interviewed the store clerk, the neighbors, and the boy she had been seen with at the football game. They administered polygraph tests that were, at the time, considered the height of forensic science. But every lead ended in a brick wall. The most profound tragedy of this period was the slow, agonizing decline of Beth's family. Her parents lived the rest of their lives in a house that was a museum of 1976. They kept her room exactly as it was on that Thursday night. The bed made, the school books on the desk, the posters on the wall. They never moved. They never changed their phone number. They spent 49 years waiting for a call that would tell them where their daughter was. Beth's father passed away in the late 90s, and her mother followed a decade later. They died without ever knowing the truth. They went to their graves with the same questions they had asked on the night she vanished. Their heartbreak was a quiet, constant presence in the town, a reminder that some wounds don't heal. They simply become part of the local geography. Eventually, the case transitioned into what investigators call a ghost case. This is the stage beyond a cold case. A cold case is still discussed. A cold case still has a detective assigned to it who might look at the file once a year. But a ghost case is one that has been forgotten by almost everyone except the family. It is a case that has been written off as a statistical impossibility. The physical file on Elizabeth Vaughn reflected this neglect. By the early 2000s, it had been moved to the very back of the archive room. If you were to open that box today, you would see the toll that half a century takes on a mystery. You would see manila folders that have turned a brittle, tea-stained orange. You would see pages of testimony typed on manual typewriters, the E's and O's filled in with ink. Inside were the Polaroid photos taken at the corner of Oak and Maple. In 1976, they were vibrant and clear. Now they are fading to a hazy, indistinct brown. The images of the street lamps and the sidewalks becoming blurred, as if the scene itself is trying to disappear into the paper. There are handwritten notes from detectives who have been dead for 20 years, scrawled observations about the weather, the suspect lists that were never narrowed down, and the sketches of a dark sedan that was seen in the area but never identified. To anyone walking through the precinct basement, that box was just another piece of discarded history. It was a collection of dead ends and faded hopes. For nearly 50 decades, the file remained frozen in time, a silent witness to a girl who was 16 years old in 1976 and would forever remain 16 in the eyes of the law. The community moved on. The corner store was torn down and replaced by a modern pharmacy. The trees that Beth walked under grew tall and thick. The generation that searched for her grew old and was replaced by people who only knew her name from a plaque in the high school gymnasium. The silence was total. It was a silence that lasted for 17,885 days. But while the world had forgotten the file, the biological evidence hidden within those yellowed pages was about to find a voice. For 49 years, the case was a collection of paper and memories. But in the spring of 2025, the investigation moved from the archive room to the clean room. The resurrection of this case began with a piece of evidence that had been preserved almost by accident. Inside that yellowed file was a small envelope containing a hair found on Elizabeth Vaughn's discarded jacket, which had been recovered months after she vanished in a remote wooded area. In 1976, that hair was useless. In the 1990s, the root was too degraded for the testing of the time. But in 2025, forensic science had reached a level of sensitivity that allowed technicians to extract a full genomic profile from the most minute and aged samples. This is where the story shifts from traditional detective work to the world of forensic genealogy. To understand the scale of this breakthrough, you have to realize that your DNA is not just a personal ID. It is a family record shared by thousands of people you have never met. Somewhere in a suburban home in a completely different state, a man in his 30s decided to take a commercial heritage test. He was curious about his ancestry, perhaps looking to find out where his great-grandparents had originated. He spit into a plastic tube, mailed it to a laboratory, and waited for a pie chart of his ethnicity. He had no idea that by clicking Submit, he was providing the final piece of a puzzle that had been missing for half a century. When investigators uploaded the profile from the 1976 crime scene into a specialized law enforcement database, the screen didn't stay blank. It lit up with a second cousin match. That man's DNA became what investigators now call the biological roadmap. By tracing the shared segments of DNA between that distant relative and the unidentified contributor, genealogists began to reconstruct a massive family tree. They worked backward through digital census records, digitized newspaper archives from the 70s, and social media connections. They were looking for a specific individual, a male who was in his 30s in 1976 and who had lived in that specific Mississippi county. The roadmap was precise. It bypassed the thousands of dead ends that had frustrated the original detectives. It narrowed the search down from an entire region to a single family, and eventually to a single man. This name had never appeared in the original 1976 file. He was a person who had never been interviewed, never been considered a person of interest, and never even been mentioned by a witness. He was a complete unknown. By the summer of 2025, the investigation entered the phase of the modern hunt. The objective was clear, but the execution required a high level of discretion. The suspect was now an 80-year-old man living in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. To his neighbors, he was a retired accountant, a man who walked his dog every morning at 8 a.m. and was known for his meticulously kept lawn. A team of plainclothes investigators moved into the area. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't drive marked cars. They used a rotating fleet of rental vehicles, moving through the streets like ghosts. They watched through high-powered lenses as the suspect went about the unremarkable business of an elderly man's life. They watched him get his mail. They watched him water his plants. They watched him sit on his porch and read the morning paper. There is a specific, quiet tension in this kind of surveillance. The detectives knew that this man had lived 49 years with the truth. They knew that a single mistake, a car parked too long in the same spot, a person looking too closely over a fence, could alert him and potentially lead to the destruction of any remainder of evidence. They were waiting for a single moment. In the legal world, it is known as abandoned property. For 6 days, the team waited for the suspect to discard something that carried his current DNA. They watched as he took out his trash, but the bags were tied tightly and placed inside a locked bin. They followed him to a local grocery store, hoping he might use a sampling spoon or discard a receipt, but he was careful, placing everything back into his pocket. Finally, on the 7th day, the suspect visited a local park. He sat on a bench for 20 minutes, drinking from a disposable water bottle while he watched a group of children playing nearby. When he rose to leave, he paused. He looked at the bottle, then at the trash bin 10 feet away. He tossed the bottle into the bin and walked toward his car. The moment he cleared the parking lot, an investigator moved in. The bottle was recovered with gloved hands, sealed in a sterile container, and immediately transported to the state forensic lab. The lab technicians worked through the night. They weren't just comparing the DNA, they were comparing two versions of the same man. One version was a 31-year-old in 1976 who thought he had left no trace behind. The other was an 80-year-old in 2025 who believed the world had forgotten his name. When the computer finalized the comparison, the match was undeniable. The probability that the DNA belonged to anyone else was 1 in several billion. The biological roadmap had reached its destination. After 49 years, the ghost of Elizabeth Vaughn finally had a face to look at, and the detectives finally had the evidence they needed to end the silence. The morning of the arrest was indistinguishable from any other Tuesday in the quiet suburb where the suspect had spent his later years. The street was lined with oak trees, the sun was just beginning to burn through the early morning mist, and there was a stillness that suggested a world at peace. On the front porch of a modest, well-maintained home, an 80-year-old man sat in a wicker chair. This was a man who had become a great-grandfather just 2 years prior. He was holding a cup of coffee, looking out at the neighborhood he had called home for over 20 years. He was a figure of total regularity, a man who had successfully outlived the detectives who first looked for him and the parents of the girl he had encountered in 1976. But at 8:15 a.m., that peace was permanently dismantled. 3 black SUVs turned onto the street, moving with a synchronized speed that signaled the end of a long-term operation. They didn't use sirens. There was no need to alert the neighborhood. The objective was already in sight. As the vehicles came to a halt in front of the house, the man on the porch didn't move. He didn't drop his coffee. He simply watched as 6 investigators, wearing tactical vests with state police emblazoned in high-contrast yellow, stepped onto his lawn. The confrontation was quiet, almost surgical. The lead investigator, a woman who wasn't even born when Elizabeth Vaughn vanished, walked up the porch steps. She spoke the suspect's name, and for the first time in 49 years, the name was met with the authority of the law. As the handcuffs clicked into place over his frail wrists, the suspect didn't ask what this was about. He didn't protest his innocence. He simply looked back at the front door of the home where his wife of 50 years was still finishing her breakfast. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the local news outlets had picked up the story, and the phrase "arrest shocks community" began to ripple through the state. The shock didn't stem from the fact that a crime had been solved. It stemmed from the identity of the person who had been taken into custody. This was a man who had been a normal neighbor in every sense of the word. He wasn't a drifter who had fled the state in 1976. He hadn't changed his name or gone into hiding. In fact, He had spent the last 5 decades living within 50 miles of the very street lamp where Beth was last seen. The suspect was revealed to be Howard Hank Miller. To the people who lived alongside him, Hank was a man of total reliability. He had worked as an accountant for a local firm for 35 years, retiring with a gold watch and a standing ovation from his colleagues. He was a man who had married his high school sweetheart just months after Beth's disappearance. He had raised 3 children, coached Little League games, and was a regular attendee at the local Presbyterian church. The reveal was a psychological blow to the region. It forced everyone to confront the reality that a person can carry a monumental secret while participating in the most mundane aspects of a shared life. Hank Miller had been at the neighborhood barbecues. He had contributed to local charities. He had sat in the same theater seats and stood in the same grocery store lines as the people who still carried missing flyers in their memories. Investigators began to look back at his life in 1976. They found that on the night Beth vanished, he was a 31-year-old husband-to-be, working a job that required him to drive a dark sedan through the very intersection where Beth's life was cut short. He had lived through the era of the massive search parties. He had seen the heartbreak of the Vaughn family on the local news. He had lived through the cold years and the ghost years, watching as the world moved on and the case was moved to the basement. For 49 years, he had functioned as a pillar of his community, all while holding a truth that would have dismantled his entire world. He had built a legacy of respect and stability on a foundation that was fundamentally broken. To his children and grandchildren, he was a hero. To the law, he was the answer to a question that had been asked for nearly half a century. The peak of the emotional payoff came when it was realized that Hank Miller had never left. He hadn't needed to. He had understood that in a world of analog records and limited forensic tools, the best place to hide a secret was behind a well-kept lawn, a steady job, and a quiet, respectable life. He had gambled that time would be his ally. But as he was led away from his porch in the summer of 2025, it became clear that time had only been a delay. The normal neighbor, the churchgoer, the great-grandfather, the man the community thought they knew, was finally forced to face the one thing he had avoided for 49 years, the light of the truth. The legal resolution of the Elizabeth Vaughn case did not bring back the world of 1976, nor did it return the decades of life that were stolen. However, it provided something that had been absent from the Mississippi Delta for nearly half a century, a definitive ending. In the autumn of 2025, a courtroom that usually handled property disputes and local grievances became the center of national attention. Howard Hank Miller, now a man whose physical presence seemed to shrink under the weight of his reality, stood before a judge. There were no outbursts, no dramatic claims of innocence. Instead, through a series of legal filings, the truth of that October night was finally articulated into the public record. The sentencing was a moment of profound, heavy silence. The court handed down a life sentence, a term that, given the defendant's age, was largely symbolic, yet legally absolute. For the law, it was the fulfillment of a debt. For the community, it was the removal of a shadow that had lingered for 17,885 days. The reaction of the Vaughn family was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. While Beth's parents were no longer there to witness the moment, her younger brother and a generation of nieces and nephews stood together. These were individuals who had grown up in a house defined by a missing daughter, people who had never met Beth but knew her through the stories and the faded photographs on the mantel. To them, the verdict was the answer to a question they had lived with since birth. They finally knew that their aunt had not simply vanished into the air. She had been a person whose life was recognized and whose memory was finally honored by the truth. Shortly after the sentencing, a modern memorial service was held at the high school. It was attended by people who had been teenagers in 1976 and by students who were 16 years old today. They unveiled a new garden, a space of quiet reflection where the sun shines clearly through the pines. It is no longer a place of mourning for a disappearance, but a place of respect for a life that mattered. As we conclude this account, we are left to reflect on the nature of the world around us. The resolution of the Mississippi 49-year cold case is a victory for modern science and the persistence of the human will. It proves that the unsolvable is often just a matter of waiting for the right tools. But it also leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable realization. Hank Miller lived 49 years as a respected member of society. He celebrated holidays, he held his grandchildren, and he contributed to his town, all while knowing exactly what happened under that street lamp in 1976. He was not a figure from a distant place. He was a person who occupied the same space and shared the same rituals as everyone else. It leads us to a final, necessary question. If a 49-year-old secret can be unearthed through a single discarded water bottle and a distant relative's curiosity, who else is currently walking among us with a hidden past? In every town, in every suburb, there are individuals who believe that time has granted them a permanent reprieve. They believe that because they have lived decades of a normal life, the events of their youth have been erased. They assume that the files in the basement will never be opened and that the evidence has turned to dust. But as we have seen today, the past is never truly gone. It is merely waiting. The biological roadmap is being drawn for thousands of other cases as we speak. The light of 2025 is reaching into the darkest corners of 1976, 1985, and 1992. The silence is being broken, one strand of DNA at a time. If you believe in the importance of these accounts, if you believe that every life deserves an ending and every family deserves the truth, I invite you to join us. Subscribe to Cold Case Reviews. By staying engaged with these stories, you help ensure that the names of the missing are never forgotten and that the pressure for answers never fades. I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me, what case from your hometown has been cold for too long? Is there a mystery that has defined your community for decades? Your comment might be the spark that leads a new generation to look at an old file. Elizabeth Vaughn was 16 years old for 49 years. Today, she is finally at rest. Thank you for listening. Stay observant. Stay curious, and remember, the truth is patient.